Steam trains were a vital part of our history in Colorado, but how much do we know about them? If we talk about a 280, is that the same as a 10-wheeler? Does a fireman fight fire? What's a combined car do? Well, let's explore this subject together. Welcome to Stories from the Midland, a collection of historic tales from Teller County and the surrounding areas. In this episode, we will be discussing some general terminology used in relation to steam trains. Trains were a major part of life in Teller County, specifically the Colorado Midland, the Midland Terminal, the Florence and Cripple Creek, and the Colorado Springs and Cripple Creek District, usually just referred to as the Short Line. So, many of the stories we cover on this channel will have at least something to do with trains. To keep the confusion to a minimum when we start using some railroad terminology, we're going to cover some of it here. Now, for those of you who are railroad aficionados, we aren't getting to be very deep into those terms. We're just covering what we feel the layperson will need to continue with our stories when we start talking about trains. First, let's talk about the Whyte notation spelled W-H-Y-T-E. As locomotives were designed and redesigned through the 19th century, they were given names that generally weren't descriptive of the locomotive at all. If you knew nothing about trains, would names like Consolidation, Mikado, or Chautauqua mean anything to you? And would you be able to point out a locomotive given the descriptor 10-wheeler, for example, when several different configurations had 10 wheels? In December of 1900, the American Engineer and Railroad Journal proposed to fix this problem with a simple yet ingenious classification system developed by Frederick Methvin Whyte. The Whyte notation system clarified locomotive type by counting an engine's wheels. Say 2 unpowered leading wheels, followed by 8 powered driving wheels, followed by 2 more unpowered trailing wheels, was given the type 282. But under the old naming convention, this was a Mikado. And duplex engines are classified by their leading wheels, the first set of driving wheels, then the second set of driving wheels, and then the trailing wheels. In at least one of our stories, we will refer to an articulated locomotive that could have a set of leading wheels, a set of driving wheels, a pivot point, another set of driving wheels, and a set of trailing wheels. In discussing the types of these, we just ignore the pivot and identify the engine type as we would a duplex locomotive. For example, the Uinta Railroad out by Grand Junction used an articulated locomotive called the Shay that had no leading wheels, 4 driving wheels, the pivot, 4 more driving wheels, and no trailing wheels. In Whyte notation, this would be referred to as an 0440G configuration, with the G indicating that the engine is driven by a gear and shaft system instead of the more traditional connecting rods. I earlier asked about the makeup of the engine called the 10-wheeler. To answer that, by the way, is that the 10-wheeler is a 460. 4 leading wheels, 6 driving wheels, and no trailing wheels. So 10 wheels in total. In Colorado, we typically dealt with 2 track gauges. The first type of gauge used to penetrate the mountains was the narrow gauge. On a narrow gauge railroad, the rails are spaced 3 feet apart, measured from the inside face of one rail to the inside of the opposing one. So, narrow gauge railroads could have a tighter turning radius, which would make them more appropriate for mountainous areas. But they're also less expensive to build, maintain, and operate. But being narrow, as their name suggests, they were less stable than their wider gauge cousins, meaning that travel had to be slower, especially around curves. The second type of track we typically see in Colorado is the standard gauge. Standard gauge tracks are 4 foot 8.5 inches apart, 1 foot 8.5 inches wider than their narrow gauge cousins. Standard gauge trains could travel faster, could have a smoother ride, and could allow for larger and wider engines for more power. First, let's talk about the running gear of a locomotive. At the basics, an engine's running gear is its wheels, axles, axle box, springs, and frame. An engine's boiler and cab sit on top of its running gear. Now, an engine's boiler houses the water that is heated to create the steam to drive the train. Most of that large cylinder on its side that makes up the steam locomotive houses the boiler. The cab of the locomotive is where the engineer, fireman, and maybe a brakeman ride and drive the locomotive. The firebox is where the fuel makes the fire that heats the water in the boiler. It sits on the back end of the boiler and should be surrounded by water whenever the locomotive is in operation. It opens into the cab so that the fireman can throw coal into the fire contained in it. The walls of the boiler are called sheets, with the crown sheet being the ceiling of the firebox. A firebox typically has a vent at its bottom also to introduce air into the fuel. The conductor is the boss of the train crew. They make sure the train gets on the move safely, efficiently, and in a timely manner, observing timetables, signals, speed limits, and other rules. They also oversee the care of the train's cargo and equipment and the actions and safety of the train crew. They need to know the makeup of the train in terms of cars, and they need to know and account for the needs of special cargo like perishables and hazardous material. They inspect the train for safety and overall operability, and it's their name on the inspection paperwork. The conductor can also be responsible for the air brake in the caboose. The engineer is the person who is responsible for the proper conduct and safety of the locomotive. They're also the person who takes over leadership of the train if the conductor is incapacitated. While they ultimately report to the conductor, they're essentially the boss of the engine and also follow the instructions of the personnel in the facilities they enter or pass through. They read and interpret orders, messages, track signals, and overall conditions and execute actions of the train based on them. For example, during the massive storm that led to the Eden train wreck, the engineer could have reacted to the weather conditions by ordering a slowing of the train. The fireman is the person responsible for feeding and monitoring the fire in the firebox. This person is also one of those responsible for ensuring the boiler has enough water to keep the firebox submerged and safe. And yes, the historical term is fireman. I once saw an article that referred to the firefighter in the engine's cab. I guess in trying to be politically correct, they misinterpreted the position. But the fireman is responsible for maintaining the fire, not putting it out. In our episodes, you'll also hear reference to the brakemen, who actually fall under the title of trainmen. They're responsible for the proper marking of the caboose, coupling and uncoupling of the cars and engine, applying and releasing handbrakes when the cars are added or subtracted from the train, and keeping an eye out for hazards on the train itself, like shifting loads or dragging equipment. The senior trainman rides in the caboose, and the other rides in either the engine or in the doghouse on the tender. The train can have other crew, many of whom deal with passengers, like the lead service attendant, coach attendants, sleeping car attendants, dining car service attendants, food specialists, and chefs. Of course, at the head of the train is the locomotive, also referred to as the engine. In addition to the engine at the head of the train, others can be cut in mid-train or at the rear as helper engines to help trains climb steep grades or move particularly heavy loads. Just behind the engine is the tender, which carries the engine's fuel and water. When engines burned coal, the firemen shoveled that coal from the tender into the firebox. Water that the tender holds is replenished by water towers along the railroad and at depots where water towers are located. When the engine is in operation, high-pressure pumps send water into the engine's boiler. The sleeper car, most well known as the Pullman, provides bunks for sleep on overnight runs and a basin for which to freshen up. The coach car is one of the most thought of when one thinks of train travel. It's the one that provides enclosed seating for the train's passengers. The baggage car, as the name implies, carries the baggage, but it also serves as the train's post office for mail and expedited freight. The dining car, of course, provides a place for passengers to eat. While it was originally only used for long train journeys, it became a regularly included car. In the golden age of steam trains, the dining car could be lavish affairs offering a high-class dining experience. The observation car, popular on trains like Colorado Midland's Wildflower Excursions and on modern-day historic scenic railroads, offers passengers what is essentially a moving open-air porch with an overhanging roof. The combined car put together two types of cars in one. Usually, a combined car is part coach and part baggage car. As many times baggage cars are an unprofitable but necessary evil, combined cars help mitigate this problem. Now, we're just covering passenger cars in this episode, and while more passenger cars do exist, this list only covers those we'll see in our Stories from the Midland episodes. And before we go, I just want to cover a term as well, and that is tractive effort. Tractive effort is the ability for a locomotive to pull or push a load. That's pretty simple. And that about covers it for this episode. Hopefully, this will serve to give you an idea of what I'm talking about as we get into train-specific stories. And as we get into those stories, you can refer back to this episode so you can hopefully answer some questions you may have. Thank you for joining me for this episode. This is Tommy Allen wishing you a great day. And should you find yourself with a little time and a desire for a little adventure, one of our nation's historic scenic steam train tours could be just what you're looking for. I look forward to having you joining me next time for more Stories from the Midland. One of our nation's historic scenic steam train tours. Wow, that's a multi-layered tongue twister. Historic Scenic Steam Train Tours. Okay, thank you for joining me for this episode. This is Tommy Allen wishing you a great day. And should you find yourself with a little time and a desire for a little adventure, one of our nation's historic steam... God. Okay, here we go. We got it. Thank you for joining me for this episode. This is Tommy Allen wishing you a great day. And should you find yourself with a little time and a little desire for some adventure, that's 1 foot 8 inches. Oh, that's 1 foot and